Okay, so thank you very much again, Philip, for the time and effort. And it's really a delight to talk to you. I have a very introductory note about you, and then we'll start with the questions. So Philip Goodchild is a professor of religion and philosophy at University of Nottingham. His expertise is in Continental, especially French philosophy and its relation to religion. He also studies the philosophy of political economy. His main books include Gilles Deleuze and the Question of Philosophy, Deleuze and Guattari, An Introduction to the Politics of Desire, Capitalism and Religion, The Price of Piety, Theology of Money, and Philosophy as a Spiritual Exercise. But the main focus of our talk today is a trilogy, and specifically this book, Credit and Faith, 2019, if I'm not right. So without further ado, Philip, my first question is, your postgraduate research focused on Gilles Deleuze and Friedrich Nietzsche, yet your recent research has been on credit and faith, linking economics and theology, where economics and theology can be understood in and through each other. Why, or what brought you there?
It's a very long story, and it did come from my earlier work on Deleuze. When I was looking at his work on difference and repetition in particular, I was primarily interested in his metaphysical work, thinking about metaphysics, and he concentrates on difference and repetition, and I was trying to think in what kind of embodied structures do we find these phenomena manifested. And that led me into, particularly because I had also wrote this book on politics of desire, his social and political thought, into thinking more and more about capitalism. I read Marx, I read some of the seminars he did around the anti-Oedipus time on the economy. And one of the crucial ideas that's only a couple of pages in the anti-Oedipus is that he developed with Felix Guattari, is the idea of a radical economist whose name escaped me for the moment. But they distinguish between two kinds of money. There's the money that you write down on a balance sheet, that is something that's always got a fixed number attached to it. And then there's the money that flows, that grows, that accumulates at a certain rate of interest, that there's this value that's moving around in addition to the money. And they're two quite separate things. So there's a difference between them, but there's also a kind of repetition. Now, I became increasingly aware of the extent to which contemporary life, political life, economic life is structured in and around money, and how money is in a certain sense a creation of balance sheets. It's something that we write down as a fixed thing, and then it seems to flow around us, and it seems to flow around us according to its own impersonal laws. I mean, we couldn't have equations of economics if there wasn't some kind of impersonal dynamic. But it struck me that whereas the economists are interested in those phenomena that return to equilibrium or approach equilibrium, that are therefore quite stable, that there's a kind of dynamic in money that puts money first as a kind of our highest value or most urgent priority, in that insofar as we want to do anything that involves cooperating with anyone else, and we've got different ideas about what's most important, we can still cooperate if we do it in and through money. So that means we have to get the money first, and getting the money first then puts that as the most urgent or necessary value before you can engage in whatever it is you want to do. So even if it's something like you want to do a big philosophical project on something, then you've got to find a way to get a grant or earn a living or get a postdoctoral position or something like that that'll fund you, and then doing whatever it takes to get the money takes priority over following the inherent values, the inherent structure, the inherent nature of the project that you want to carry through. So this is the kind of thoughts that I was having in the late 1990s, the early 2000s, that led it first into the Capitalism and Religion book, and then which to some extent it did come out of Marx reading Aristotle, but also Deleuze's student Eric Allier's reading Marx, reading Aristotle, looking at the relationship between time and capital. So I wanted to develop that. And in the book Theology of Money, I felt that Marx's analysis of the capitalist system in terms of the commodity form and in terms of exchange, great analysis, really insightful, really deep, but incomplete. And there are signs that when he's starting to analyze credit in Capital Volume 3, he's beginning to realize that money doesn't quite operate as a commodity in the sense of the exchange of commodities, that it's not that we do something with money, but money does something to us. And so it's that notion of money that I really developed in my theology of money, that money is essentially, it's a human creation, but once we created it, once we're using it, it starts to dominate us and impose its values upon us and its priorities, and it gives us kind of an ethics and a metaphysics and a whole framework for thinking about things. So that's where I got to in 2007. And this philosophical analysis of money that is according to its replacement of God as the sort of source of supreme value as effective in political culture. So this critique of money that was intended to go beyond Marxism and describe a financial economy without me really knowing very much about finance at the time. I predicted the large economic crash as inevitable, but I had no idea how it would unfold. So it was really interesting to watch it unfold. And ever since, I've been able to look back and look at other people's analyses of what's really been going on, because there we have at last, in its naked form, an economy in which we have precisely the same human resources, precisely the same human freedoms, precisely the same human desires and goodwill. And in this depression, this great recession, no one can do what they want to do anymore, because there's this crisis of credit, there's this lack of trust in each other, a lack of general credit. So that led me to think that we need to rethink the nature of our economy, not simply as a monetary economy, but as a credit economy, because money is only a physical embodiment of credit or trust anyway. So the really generative or creative dimension of human society, human existence, is actually trust, which can take the form of credit, that is some kind of defined mark or symbol of trust that's been invested, or it can take the form of faith, which is an orientation towards the future, in which one simply trusts that one is aiming towards something that's good or better than where things are now. So the religious notion of faith and the economic notion of credit started to seem like two different aspects of the same thing. And one of the most important ideas in the 2019 Credit and Faith book is that we can look at life from two different angles, which are actually temporal directions. If we want to have knowledge of life, then as Hegel says, we have to look back. We have to look back at things, how they've emerged, how they've been formed, what's caused them, what shape they've turned into, what patterns of relationships they enter into. And knowledge is concerned with reflection. Only reflection produces knowledge. But if we want to turn towards the future, and of course, all our cooperation with each other is, and all our endeavors and our desires and our aspirations are future oriented, then we don't know the future. There's no knowledge of the future, where our thinking is of an entirely different character and nature. And it seems to me that in the whole course of the Western Enlightenment, there's been a forgetting of the significance of trust. Until recent times. It's been so so obvious that people start talking about it. But what, even when people talk about it and its importance, very few go so far as to say, at the metaphysical level of the foundation of society, the creative force is our faith and our credit. And so if we, and my concern has always been for our incredible predicaments that we're getting into at this stage of modernity, with not only economic crises and perpetual debt crises that seem insolvable, but beyond that, the ecological crises that have concerned me enormously for decades, really. And, you know, we had plenty of knowledge that something needed to be done back in 1988. You know, back at international moves were made then by the United Nations, first in 1998, and established things in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit. Since then, the whole of the human race has largely behaved entirely irrationally by ignoring this extremely evident problem that at first people didn't really believe in it because they were just told about it by scientists, but now we see it in all the wildfires and the hurricanes and cyclones and the Greenland, the ice caps melting in Greenland and Antarctica, and the whole destabilization of the weather in our daily experience. And here, and I suppose this has only been known since about 2003 and 4, there's the danger of crossing these thresholds beyond which what has been a stable climate, and all our knowledge, all our reflection has been assuming that roughly the world we have is a stable world, that we know where we are in it, that our concepts aren't going to change in the middle of our conversations, or the weather is not going to change, or the ground's not going to give way beneath us, or society is not going to suddenly have some kind of collapse or crisis, or a war isn't going to break out that's going to upset our business deals. All these things are taken for granted, and yet it's not the real world, which of course is radically unstable. And the climate in which human life has been lived is a period of rare stability, rare what's the word, a rare temperateness, so that human life can thrive in that stability. So we've been approaching quite rapidly this threshold. And even now that everyone is acutely aware and the deniers have been defeated, even now there's still very little rational behavior or urgency to deal with it, as compared to, for example, dealing with a pandemic or dealing with a war where decisive action gets taken. So I've been interested in, why are we irrational? What is it that that motivates reason? And it seems to me that there is this other kind of reasoning that we've forgotten how to do, we're not really capable of engaging with. It's reasoning in terms of credit and faith, which is absolutely essential in order to recognize our limits, our thresholds, in order to recognize what's important in life, what really matters, what's significant. And yet we have all these sort of dynamisms, these positive feedback processes that are there in our reasoning, as well as in our economic behavior, that simply take us over and make us wildly irrational. So that's some of the agenda of what goes into credit and faith. And book Credit and Faith is looking for the roots of thinking differently, so that we can address that particular problem.
Right. Interestingly enough, Flip, but it's very evident, like when you open the book, you see that even a person has spent many years reflecting on these issues. But one of the characteristics of your whole book, I mean, this book, Credit and Faith, at least, is to challenge the sharp distinction between religious and secular. As you put it in the introduction of the book, I'm quoting you, the determining idea to be explored in this book is that problems of economic faith and religious faith meet and are indeed two sides of the same human experience. How?
So there are certain things that make up human experience that we have only insofar as we distribute them. They're how we spend our time, in our labor, what we give our attention to, what we mark as significant or give credit to, what we place our trust in, what we love, what we care for. These things make up life. Now, my assertion is that in an economy, there is a distribution of how people spend their time, what they give their attention to, what they record in account books or anything else, what they in contracts, what they count as significant and noteworthy, what they're going to give credit to and try and see if this is fulfilled or that is fulfilled, what they're going to trust, etc., etc. And it seems to me that if that's what an economy is, that's the same thing as what traditional religions have always been. They've been about how you divide up your day, how you spend your time in prayer, what sort of things you're going to give attention to, what sort of things really matter, what is the ultimate root of the value of values on which we can all agree and through which we can cooperate, the grounds on which people can be trustworthy, and so you can engage with them in contracts and business deals, etc., because you expect them to be pious. This is what religions have always been, and it struck me that there's as much a misunderstanding of religion as there is a misunderstanding of economy. And having worked in theology and religious studies departments for 30 years, if you only concentrate on the internal discourse of a religion, you can miss what it's doing in practice, in terms of how it's giving order and shape and trust and configuration to a human life, to its time, to its care, its attention, etc., etc. And so I see them as operating on the same ground in an economy and a religion, that in pre-capitalist, I'm certainly not the first person to argue this, but in pre-capitalist economies, there was quite a close integration of religious and secular life, such as when you say your prayers and when you plow the fields, the two go together. You plow the fields, you say your prayers to get help the seed growing, etc., etc. The two are closely integrated. People's customs and people's habits through which they sustain themselves and reproduce their physical wealthy life. So in a traditional society, these are integrated and support each other. In a modern society where money has taken over the organization of credit from religion, it means that in practice, religion matters much less. You can be religious if you want to, but you have to do that on a Friday or Saturday or Sunday, depending on the religion it is. The rest of the week, you're likely to be living your life as your employer expects you to, and then in your free time as the entertainment corporations expect and encourage you to, where possible. And so there's less and less scope for religion to have any determining role on care and attention and time and love and trust. So it starts to seem as though It's about these very different things, such as belief in an afterlife or some big cosmological vision of the world, which have always been dimensions of religion, but their dimensions in the past were integrated with, you know, what you did right here and now was shaped by having a belief in the afterlife. In modernity, much less so. You know, workers who are religious and non-religious work alongside each other. They're culturally indistinguishable largely. They have similar interests, similar lives, similar ethics, similar values. There's a few points they clash, yes, of course, but for the most part, we're determined in the same sort of way. So this is why I think it's really interesting to think the economy and religion together. And in the book in particular, I do focus on the Gospels, on the New Testament, early Christianity, because I think the link between economy and theology is a bit more explicit, partly because if you look at Jesus' parables, they're all about things from how to run an estate or a vineyard. It's not a market economy. It's a kind of economy where there might be foreign or absent landowners, and then tenants who have to, or estate managers who have to do things. But so many of his parables that he seems to say, let's set aside the Jewish law. Let's not bother thinking too hard about that. Yet let's start to think about life in terms of, you know, there's these two people who have debts, and one's a really small debt, one's a really big debt, and they both get forgiven. And what difference does it make to them? That's the nature of Jesus' teaching. And so much as the other teachings about feasts or about family interrelationships, or it's set within a largely pre-market, though an economy that's being entirely destabilized at the time through integration in the Roman Empire, through setting up large estates for tax farming, through the building of brand new cities like Sepphoris, 5 miles from Nazareth, where very probably Jesus' father Joseph and Jesus himself may have worked as a builder, carpenter, builder, woodworker, setting up new buildings for the sake of turning the whole of Galilee, the land that he lived, into a large kind of tax farm.
Interesting, right? Look, there is, although you, to some extent, you explained it, but according to one of your definitions, I mean, a working definition, as you call it, of credit, you mean that to give credit is to invest in someone or something with significance or trust. And then you put this definition of credit next to the economic conceptions of credit, whose converse is debt. How does this economic sense relate to the theological sense?
So normally when we think of credit in economic terms, we think of borrowing money or giving someone some money to borrow. It's a very slippery word. We might use it as a shorthand for credit worthiness, in the sense of a credit rating. So you think how much someone is going to be reliable as someone to invest in or lend to. And credit and debt are seen as the obverse of each other. And this means that credit is in some sense defined reciprocally by debt, that if you're given a credit, you then will have to pay it back, usually with interest, by a certain date at a certain time. And I think this is quite different from my working definition of investing someone or something with a mark of significance, saying, you know, this matters, this is important. There's this other, which you might think it's a metaphorical sense of credit, as, you know, giving someone credit and saying, oh yeah, that's trustworthy, or, you know, they did a good thing, or no, that was really great, or or that we need much more of that. We need to invest in that and encourage that and let it grow. That is a kind of temporal investment
Mm.
which changes the future, but it's not reciprocal in the sense that you invest something with a mark of significance, it doesn't have to pay you back. So this is a non-economic notion.
Mm.
And what I'm drawing from here is some remarks in the Gospels where Jesus, tells people, if you lend to those who give in return, what credit is that to you? Let's get the word charis here, normally grace gets translated as credit in English. And that's one of his hard sayings that explicitly seems to teach against reciprocity. Now, I don't take that as a moral instruction, such as we should try and avoid reciprocity. I take it more as an ontological revelation that actually what makes up our experience, our lives, our society, is the investment of non-reciprocal credit in the sense of a mark of significance of someone or something which you do whenever you give attention, you give care, you give trust, you give love, you spend your time and so on. So I think one of the central dynamics I explore in the book is how, in a religious context, we can conceive credit in this way: the credit that is given to God the Creator, to the world, or the credit that we in turn give to things as, in some sense, part of some created order, and so having significance and a place in it. That's a religious way of looking at things, which gets undermined by thinking it in purely reciprocal terms of generosity, because then you reduce reciprocity, because then you reduce it to you've invested a certain amount of money, you want that amount of money back again at some time, as though you've only given the money, and you forget that by investing money in the first place, you've said, wow, I like this. I think it matters. I think it needs to grow. It needs investing in. And so much of human life is made up of these non-reciprocal relations, particularly relations that parents have with children, or that educators have with those they're educating. So much of enculturation is made up of these non-reciprocal relationships. And so much, I think, of the root of our economic relationships is made up of these relationships of trust and credit. Ultimately, you if you're going to do business with someone, you've got to either trust them or trust that the money they pay you is going to keep its value, or that there's going to be some authority that's going to come down on them if they break their contract. So you're trusting someone somewhere, and so things like money and governments guaranteeing contracts, they're really useful way of extending this interpersonal trust that can only exist to some extent on a local level when you know people, or people know those people, and so you can establish their creditworthiness by reputation. Well, what the invention of money and extension through paper money, and the invention of all sorts of auditing and bookkeeping procedures, and the role of governments in upholding contracts, what all that does is it makes possible a kind of international trade that would be very rough and ready and uncertain and wild in its purely disordered form, but which was certainly possible, has been possible going back through history. Perhaps it was the exchange of goods at times, caravans crossing the deserts, but in a religious culture such as the Islamic culture that extended across so much of the world in the Middle Ages, you didn't need a strong government because you had a strong religion, and then you could extend your trading relationships in a big way because there was some security for extending trust. So that's the relationship between a kind of religiously based trust,
right,
and credit that's seen in a rather reductive and reduced way as the obverse of debt, which actually doesn't do justice to the economy. And one of my main ideas is if we don't really understand what an economy is, we'll not conduct it in anything like a rational way, and we'll pursue all sorts of unlimited quests in the hope of shoring up trust in places which ultimately can't ensure it.
Philip, I have a question which might be a bit irrelevant here, but somehow when you're talking about credit, I mean, all these non-reciprocal goods like credit, like, let's say, attention, like care, like forgiveness, love and life, what makes them less important than reciprocal understanding of them? And what I mean, what is the kind of political shift or paradigm shift that makes them less important in comparison to reciprocal understanding of credit or love or forgiveness?
I think there of course they're understood as important, but they're less theorized and recorded and counted as significant as compared to, they might be seen as subjective or related to the family, the private sphere. They don't really have some sort of marks of public significance in the way that they might do within a religious context. So the question would be, how have we shifted from religions based around things such as charity or zakat, where these non-reciprocal goods are seen as enormously important dimensions of life around which it can be oriented, to a more so-called practical world where we have money, we have systems of auditing, we have governments to ensure trust. And the reason, I think, is a complex one, and in some sense it's a historical process. In some sense it's a logical or dialectical process, and I usually hate mixing up those two things. I don't like accounts of history that says, oh, it's a logical unfolding, but it happened at this rate. So obviously there's got to be some kind of integration here. The thing about, let's start with attention. I mean, love normally involves a lot of attention. That means you've got to be present. It's expensive to you in terms of your time. There's only so much you can give. But there are certain ways of saying, look, I accept this is significant. I'm going to take it for granted that it's significant. I might leave a sort of mental note or a mark that it's significant, or I might give it a mark that someone else can recognize its significance. And that kind of sense of credit is then detached from the act of giving credit and becomes a symbol that's available in wider culture. And the archetype of this would be a coin that has a value because some ruler has stamped their image on it to show that they value it and they want it back. That then exchanges hands, and its original meaning and significance and its original addressee, who's given credit to it, who's given credit through it, is forgotten. So it's of the nature of language, it's the nature of symbolization, it's the nature of money, that it loses its immediate meaning and scope of relevance. In the same way that, suppose you've got a family heirloom that belonged to your grandmother, and like a ring or something, and it's been in the family for generations. It means a lot to you. Someone breaks into your house and steals the ring. They sell it on the market to whoever will buy it, who thinks, oh, nice ring. It has none of that sentimental meaning or value attached. It's just, a ring that can then be sold on again and again. So there's this, and it happened, it's not just with thieves. Time works like this anyway. We forget. We ultimately, who was that ancestor who had this ring. I mean, what did it mean to them? It doesn't mean anything to me now. Ultimately, the progress of time means that these investments of meaning in things are devalued, just as it happens through a transfer to other owners. It happens through investing is going to transfer to other owners. So it's a natural process that will happen anyway. So there would have to be a process of psychological investment in things and psychological de-investment things. And otherwise, psychic life would be impossible. If everything was enormously meaningful and significant all the time, we could hardly move through the world. We have to ignore most things most of the time in order to get by. So there's this natural process going on. But I think what's more interesting is a historical process that's made possible by a money economy. So if you take an economy where people largely interact and know each other and trust each other, and they know who works hard, they know who's religious, they know who's trustworthy, they know who's well motivated to help anyone out who's in need. These are the people who are going to be the ones who have credit in a social sense. People, they'll be highly regarded, people are very capable and wise, that can be highly regarded. And then in contrast to those, there are going to be people at the other end of the spectrum who are a bit lazy, who waste their money, who are a bit sloppy about what they count as important and how religious they are, etc., etc. And they're the distrusted. So you can have this economy emerge where even in a trust-based economy, where there's the trusted and the distrusted, and then the trusted are desperately trying to defend themselves from the distrusted. Now, if you have a set of contractual relationships, a set of debts emerging in such an economy, which can happen if there's not enough cash, if there's not enough coinage to go around. And I'm thinking very specifically about the history of England in the 16th and 17th century, where you had an economy that was growing quite rapidly, that was moving over initially in the Tudor period to sheep farming and exporting wool abroad. And that led to an influx of wealth and a change in people's professions. So there were rapid growth in towns and villages, and people doing craft work at home, and everyone was a sort of a craftsperson and buyer and seller and little private merchant, if you like. And in this situation, people were saving their coins for the really important things, like the really major sources of supplies that they needed, or to pay their rent, or to pay their taxes, or some really big business deal that was going through. They'd save up their coinage for that, which meant and because the economy was growing more anyway, they need more coin too. So there was more of a shortage. So it becomes this self-reinforcing cycle that the less coinage there is compared to what is needed, the more people hoard it, so the less coinage there is. In that context, people turn instead to buying on credit in the sense of deferred payment. So you have an economy where people normally don't pay upfront in cash. Money is used as a denominator, saying, I owe you this much, but like, I owe you 3 cows, you don't provide someone 3 cows, you end up doing a deal with a few other people and then cancel out the cows. It's the same with cash. In a small-scale local economy, you can eventually get people together and say, well, I owe you this, you owe me this, he owes me this, she owes him that. And then that cancels out this much of it, but if you just give me a couple of chickens, that'll be fine. That will settle it. So you can have an economy working by deferred payment, where there's not really a set time scale, but there's an immense obligation to pay your debts. Because if someone keeps putting off paying their debts, as people did, or certain people of certain classes did in England, they would mean that others who couldn't their suppliers couldn't pay their own debts, and the default would spread through by contagion. So in the late 16th and the 17th century, England had this economy that went from crisis to crisis, where everyone was interested in everyone else's morals, how hard working they were, how much time they spent in the public house drinking ale, whether they were seen in church, whether they were known to help out their neighbors, etc., etc. So everyone had an interest in everyone else's creditworthiness. It's quite an oppressive society, if you like, with the pillars of society looking down very much on those who were distrusted as threatening the whole fabric of society. Into this problem, you then add in the 1690s massive amounts of government debt to fight wars that was just growing and growing, and not enough coinage to pay the government debts that's in circulation. So in 1690, about 1696, there was this massive recoinage in England when they decided all the coins were really old, they were worn out, people had clipped little bits of silver off them, people didn't really value them highly, and there was a distrust of the coins, there was a lack of credit, so people thought they distrusted coins. So they called them all back in, that's £6 million in sterling as it was then, reminted them lovely fresh silver coins, 4 million went out again. Because they'd all been worn out and clipped, so there wasn't enough there for 6 million in the first place. And that intensifies the crisis. So 1697, they decide, right, we've got this brand new Bank of England that's lent money to the king for a permanent debt for the wars. What if we let them also issue some promissory notes, banknotes amounting to £20 each to reliable business people who need them, and then the Bank of England will get its money back because it's got this loan at 8% permanent loan, 8% annual interest from the king. So as far as the state or the treasury exists and can take taxes, then that income is guaranteed. So the money will be valued. If you've got one of these promissory notes, you can always take it back to the Bank of England to exchange it for gold. Therefore, no one takes it back because they don't need to, because they don't distrust it. And this, I suggest in the book, produces an absolutely massive change in people's economic behavior. Prior to this time, everyone's integrated closely together, and your wealth is what other people think of you. Your wealth is essentially whether other people will come to your aid and lend to you because they know you're a good, reliable, creditworthy person when you need it. You don't have loads of money in your bank account. You don't have loads of goods in your shop. You don't necessarily need lots of expensive luxuries, except as a symbol of how well you're doing. That is how creditworthy you are. That is how respectable you are. That is how much a sign for others then that they can cooperate, and it builds and it adds to the stability of the society and its instability. So once you've got this situation of integration, but also crisis, and you try and solve the crisis by introducing a much wider circulation of something like cash in form of banknotes. Massive change. The best way you can be that honorable, upstanding business person is to pay in cash. If you can get hold of the cash and pay in cash, it's like wearing those fine clothes. It's like having that good opinion of you. In fact, it doesn't matter what everyone else thinks of you, so long as the Bank of England is going to honor its promises, then your promises don't matter. You can use the Bank of England in your place as your guarantor for your promises. You hand over a Bank of England promissory note that never gets cashed in because everyone trusts essentially the economy. And that, I would say, leads to a massive change from a Puritan society with Puritan ethics into this cash-based society where the honorable thing to do is to pay your debts in cash. The honorable thing to do is to engage in business practices that are seeking cash. And so you got this kind of integration of apparently selfish behavior, the profit motive, and purely socially minded behavior of being an upright, honorable, but reliable person who's trustworthy to do business with. And that is where I see it's the origins of finance capitalism as a much more extensive, obviously there existed banknotes before, but as a much more extensive orientation for the whole economy centered around London. And then you only have to throw in the South Sea bubble and lots of speculation shares on top of that, in which everyone engages in totally selfish behavior, and most people end up getting burned through this huge bubble. And suddenly everyone realizes, oh, we're a lot less moral than we thought we were. We can trust ourselves a lot less. We can trust each other a lot less. Let's rely on the hard money and much less on people's promises.
Philip, in another book, The Theology of Money, I'm quoting you, you say that all religion, in essence, directs and distributes time, attention, and devotion. Religions enrich life by establishing patterns for living, end of quote. Doesn't it apply to money, but more recently and more specifically now to cryptocurrency?
Well, yeah. It applies to money, but money has its ambivalence because we end up having to take care of money. Of course, yes, people spend their time taking care of religion and ensuring it gets reproduced, but working according to the profit motive means that people end up, as I said, spending nearly all their working day not serving God, but serving money, in the sense that money gives you this enormous freedom. Once you've got it, you can spend it on whatever is available, or invest it in whatever possible investments are available, think are worthwhile, or you can give it away to whatever cause you think it's really worth giving to. It gives you that huge amount of liberty, which, because of this promise of liberty, it then means in practice that most people are going to spend most of their time trying to get hold of money. So they've got this little bit of liberty that quickly slips away from them as soon as they spend it. So money is ambivalent. And you don't get quite that same ambivalence in, religions are complex, and different ones will different aspects of different ones will perform a different way, but you don't get quite that same, they're largely stable patterns, whereas the profit motive is in some sense an unlimited quest for more and more money, more and more influence, more and more freedom. Cryptocurrencies. I haven't really written about cryptocurrencies in the Credit and Faith trilogy. I'm a little bit uncertain as to how much they change things and in what direction they change things. Of course, they create money out of nothing, or through totally absurd and meaningless processes of data mining that are set up just for the sake of being secure and difficult, that are otherwise pointless, and burn huge amounts of energy. So they only have, the thing about cryptocurrencies is, and it's the same really with other currencies, even gold. Gold's, some people like to wear it as jewelry, but otherwise it's got very few other usages. So it's not got a lot of use value. People only like it because they like it, because it has symbolic value, because other people like it, because so the value of gold depends on people's preferences.
Mm.
And in a similar way, the cryptocurrencies are enormously unstable in their value
Mhm.
because they only exist as a matter of preferences. And in particular, or initially when they're first brought in, they're brought in and used because the transactions are much less traceable than those that pass through regular currencies, regular banks are recorded. So it's easier for criminal transactions or transactions you don't want to be taxed or you don't want other people to know about, et cetera, et cetera. And then the speculative price of a cryptocurrency depends upon its use value, underlying use value, which is how much criminals or whoever are going to actually use it for exchange. But most people use it for speculation.
Right.
So cryptocurrencies, their way, there's an ideology associated with them. The ideology that states control money far too much and money is political, and there is such a thing as a completely democratic free market that could be enabled by a cryptocurrency. I think that's completely ideological. It's completely fantastic that so as soon as you start seeing value in terms of a social mark of trust, then there has to be some kind of trustworthy basis, some institution like a central bank or is playing that kind of role that is trusted for now. Otherwise, you're just going to get these wild fluctuations. So my initial thoughts about cryptocurrency are ones of absolute suspicion that on the one hand, it's pursuing an ideology of a purely free market that has never been what it exists in economic life, and is in some sense the basis through which we construct economic life is through believing in this illusion of a free market, which in the second book in Economic Theology, I do a bit more on trying to take that apart. So cryptocurrencies, I don't know how much they organize people's actual lives in the way of how much they distribute care and love and attention and trust, and but in a way that more other economic activities that are geared towards national currencies more obviously do, but perhaps they do. If they do, then they're not essentially very different from the state currencies, but they don't necessarily have a state and the power of the state to back them up. And then you're left with speculative, a mixture of market value, speculative preference, trust. Some people will still believe that currencies have a true actual value, which is the market value in national currencies, but it's very hard to believe that of a cryptocurrency, that there's a real value that Ethereum should be valued at today. And it might have got drifted from its value or not be close to its underlying value.
Philip, again, in Theology of Money, you write that, I'm quoting you, the history of Christian reflection on money is of limited service insofar as it concentrates on subjective attitudes towards wealth. The history of economic science is of limited service insofar as it concentrates on an objective science of money as a functional instrument. Was it your aim to just expand this understanding?
Yes, what I wanted to do there is develop a philosophy of money that's quite different from anything understood in economics, but also, despite the title Theology of Money, it has to break with most of what's there in the Christian tradition. Although I do draw on one or two more radical Christian thinkers from time to time. There's an Anglican bishop called Peter Selby who wrote some good work, and there's been this Christian Council for Monetary Justice. There's this really tiny, minor pressure movement that has a a good understanding of money. There's been this really obscure movement in England called the social credit movement that emerged in around the 1920s, 1930s, and there are other movements being placed in Argentina and United States at the end of the 19th century. I draw on this heterodox tradition for understanding money as credit that is different from economic science, which basically starts with the human subject and says, we're free to do whatever we want. We can enter into whatever contracts we want, whatever exchanges that we want. To do so is essentially a kind of barter, but that's facilitated because barter then has the problem of how do you make sure your wants are reciprocated with the people you're doing business with. Money then it is this marvelous exchange mechanism that sets up a market to replace barter, and it's just a tool. That's the standard account in economics, which completely misses the notion that money is being created all the time. It's being created as a debt when someone takes out a loan. When someone takes out a loan, they're making a promise to pay back that amount of money with interest. So they've got to somehow extract from the economic system the same amount of money that they've spent. So they've got to get it back again, wherever it's gone, plus a bit more in interest. So someone somewhere else has had to borrow some so that you can get hold of their money. And in that respect, I see money as every single piece of money that's exchanged has as it were, has someone's name rubbed out. It's not only the name of the chief cashier of the central bank or whoever it is who signs the note. It's also the name of the person who borrowed it in the first place. And this is a really complicated thing. I explain it a bit in Theology of Money and Economic Theology. It's once you've got your head around it, it's quite simple that a bank doesn't need to have the money in its reserves to lend it to you, because it can write it down in your bank account. So you've got that money to spend. Suppose it's a large loan, they're giving you a mortgage, you're going to go and buy a house. So there's a bank that gives you the money to buy a house. You immediately buy a house before the money goes. Someone then has the money from selling their house. They put in their bank. And at the end of the 2 days, the banks get together and say, well, how many houses have you sold today? How much money has come in? How much money do we have to pay you now? And how much money do you have to pay us now at the end of the day? Most of it cancels out. The excess can be dealt with at the overnight rate and say, oh, well, we owe you a bit more today. Okay, we'll pay you this tiny overnight rate of interest instead. So have that little bit of money, and then we'll see how things stand tomorrow. Because so most of it gets cancelled out. It's the same thing, exactly the same thing that was happening in the 17th century in villages between local people. It's now there's a privilege of banks who can do this, who can get together and cancel out their debts in a way that in a distributed economy, other people can't do. So the two things that come out of this is that money is nothing like an egalitarian marketplace, because it's enabled by these centralized institutions who can engage in clearing relationships with each other, who have these long-term relationships of trust. So there's this hierarchy in the economy. And secondly, there's not a tendency towards equilibrium, because there's a continual creation of debt and a continual demand, an obligation, let's say a continued obligation on individuals and corporations and governments and local governments that are all in debt they have to engage in activities that will enable them to pay back their debt.
Mm.
So suddenly economic life becomes incredibly disciplined. It's not that we're free to spend to work as we wish or spend our money on what we want, because we've all got debts, and we're all going to, if we don't pay them, we're all going to fall out of the economic system, and no one will trust us, and we won't be able to live with any degree of comfort anymore. So we're all under an obligation. And so there's this autonomous system that controls and shapes and sets the playing field for our behavior, but we pretend to ourselves that we're quite free and can do as we wish. And it's that kind of dynamic that I'm setting up. So I've drifted from your original question. That's the standard economic understanding of money. That's why it's wrong. There are clear statements in the literature. The modern monetary theory exposes this very well. That's been talked about a lot in public discourse recently. And Keynes basically had a pretty good picture, but he retreated from some of his insights. Bank of England is explicit about how this works nowadays in its official publications. Religious, going on to Christianity. So I do that briefly. So much of Christian thought has been a kind of subjectivism again, concerned with what the subject. Money is the root of all evil. Well, no, it's love of money, they say. Look carefully. Money's just a tool. It's neutral. You can do wonderful things with money. John Wesley says, earn all you can, work all you can, earn all you can, give all you can. That's a traditional Christian attitude towards money. But the love of money is then seen as the root of all evil, because what's wrong is giving time, attention, care, love and trust to money at the expense of giving that to other people.
Right.
So that's been the Christian attitude, as though we were free to simply make our own choices and decide on our own priorities and commitments, and decide to give our lives to God instead of to our employers. Right. And I think that's an illusion because of this obligation that I've said. We have an obligation to those to our families as well as ourselves to ensure a decent standard of living for them and for us. So we're under an obligation to participate in the money system to do so, which means we're under an obligation to take out debts or employment contracts, the kinds of debts, or whatever it is that we need to ensure this happens. And so we get integrated into this impersonal dynamic system, which has its own internal dynamism that ends up controlling us.
Right. Philip, I have one last question here about the book. If it is true that, your whole project and money, if it is true that you read financialized capitalism and the neoliberal world order, which it produced as ultimately a product of Christian tradition, yet there are other writers. For example, in 2016, Joshua Rami in Politics of Divination says that neoliberal, I'm quoting him, neoliberalism retains its ideological appeal partly due to the way collective faith in market forces validates neoliberal ideology as a disavowed form of divination, end of quote. He ultimately claims that neoliberal financialization reflects a divinatory, oracular, and positively pagan religious sensibility. What is your take on his understanding, especially because he opens to large extent to chaos, luck, and contingency in his project?
Yeah, I would say that Joshua and I have been close friends since 2007, and my work has influenced him enormously, and you couldn't pick anyone else in the world who's closer to my project in this overall outlook to contrast with me. yes, certainly he's done work on the contingency, on divination, on this forward-looking, this pagan dimension of neoliberal markets, and I think there's some mileage in that. I am not, unlike some people, and there are people like those who are broadly in the tradition of Giorgio Agamben, who or even Michel Foucault's take on neoliberalism, who see neoliberalism emerging from essentially Christian sources. Some people come a bit out of Hannah Arendt in this direction. I'm not making the claim that neoliberalism is Christian in origin. That it's a I think there's potential for understanding it in theological terms. My book, The Theology of Money, is about a pagan theology, the theology of money, where the main difference, though, is that whereas Joshua emphasizes the contingency of pure market events and how financial speculators will be trying to anticipate and divine what these contingencies will be, I've been more interested in looking at the financial economy as an integrated system and as a kind of quasi-machine, as a kind of quasi-determinist system that tends to control human behavior. And part of this difference is that Joshua is interested in neoliberalism, which has become a very slippery word that people use in all sorts of different ways. I'm less that to some extent subsumes economics into a certain kind of political attitude, a certain and contemporary financial economy into a certain political culture. My own approach is to be interested in the economy in a bit more of a hard sense rather than purely political attitudes. Because on my account, whatever politics we take, our political decisions are simply a matter of trying to hold the gas in the bottle or letting it out. And the more we let the gas out the bottle, that's probably the wrong metaphor, the more it's set free and the more it controls us. So it's a bit more that it's a sorcerer's apprentice, if that's a better analogy, that the more we let the economy free, the financial economy free of human control, the more it will control us. Now, it may control us through a set of highly contingent events about which we can speculate. That might be part of its operation. But to me, ultimately, it's still a machine rather than a set of random contingent events. And that's perhaps where theoretically our interests diverge to different faces of what makes up finance, even though we might have quite similar politics in how we deal with it.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Philip. That was fascinating. Actually, I learned a lot reading the book, a lot of references, a lot of new facets, I mean, economically, theologically, politically, philosophically. That was really rewarding to read the book, and it was a great pleasure to talk to you. And I have to thank you for the non-reciprocal time and attention actually I've experienced with you.
Well, you've been paying me attention too. It's been a reciprocal aspect. If I can then grab something back for myself, I just want to say that the book Cred and Faith is just the beginning of what I see as a very distinctive and new and fresh way of looking at things. The second volume, Economic Theology, then turns to which we haven't talked about, then turns to analyze our contemporary economy and the way in which economics factors into it to keep reproducing it, and the beliefs that are there in economics. There's a section, a large section on the conflicting constraints that emerge, how our economy is essentially bound to contradict itself and head towards crisis. And there's an extended set of essays on finance and how finance is designed to restore economic behavior towards something that approximates a bit more to a perfect market, and in doing so completely subverts its own aims and introduces a whole set of other tendencies with its derivatives, etc., etc. So there's that other body of work. And then perhaps much more radically and different still, there's the third book in the series, The Metaphysics of Trust, which sets aside looking at historical roots and sets aside looking at the contemporary economy to ask, what are the most basic concepts in and through which we distribute trust in the modern world? And to what extent are they poorly formed concepts based on illusion? And how do we reform them? How do we reform our notion of what makes wealth, what makes power, or what makes determination, what will make something machinic or predictable or reliable or trustworthy? And there's some radical exploratory new ideas that puts trust at the center of everything. It says basically the problem is not just with modernity. The problem goes back to Plato and the ancient Greeks, that we've been putting knowledge first, whereas actually in reality, when we think, we don't know very much at all. And even the things we knew yesterday, we still trust in today, and we can't remember the reasons or the evidence for them. So actually trust is at the center of human thought and life and reason, and what makes something trustworthy, what are good grounds for trust, for the bad grounds for trust. That's the agenda of that book.
I really do hope to have another chance to talk to you about the metaphysics of trust, if possible, like in coming month. I don't know, like I would be really happy to hear again your ideas. We can keep in contact, and once you have the time.
That would be great. I look forward to that.
Yeah. So that was my pleasure. Thank you very much again.